Newscast from the BBC.
It's Laura in the studio.
And it's Henry in the studio.
And today's big story is, I think, Keir Starmer's promise on migration. He said sort of cryptic things for quite a long time now since he's been leader. Yes, migration is too high. Yes, I think that 700,000 or thereabouts people coming legally to the country is too big a number. But today, for the first time in this campaign, he's been clear about a commitment to get the numbers down, which, Henry, that is a different thing to just saying, oh, I think it's too high. Why?
It's because in 5 years' time, should he become Prime Minister, should the next general election be around that time, people like you and me will say, you made a commitment in the last general election. How have you delivered against it? And I also think it's significant because of the politics of it. And the politics of it are pretty obvious, but we should spell it out anyway. Mm-hmm. This is Keir Starmer, yet again, as he has basically every day since a few months into his leadership of the Labour Party, though it was a bit different at the start. Mm-hmm. He is trying to basically bash voters over the head with a message that he is moving the Labour Party way to the right of where it was in the 2019 and 2017 general elections, when their approach to immigration would have been quite different to this. That is the messaging here.
And we can see that this is something that they really wanted to highlight in particular, because he's pulled out one of those old cues that is like a big politician grabbing a megaphone and saying, I really, really mean this, because he said, read my lips.
But tell me if I'm wrong.
Isn't
read my lips famous because George Bush Sr. said, read my lips, no new taxes.
And then
increased taxes and lost a presidential election to Bill Clinton partly as a result.
Indeed so. It is. But it's all, I mean, like often like political phrases, they're sort of, they are so taken out of context and then used in all sorts of different ways that actually they, sometimes mean the opposite to what they started off. Or they're things that are used wrongly, which Paddy and I, like a couple of sort of a crotchety old aunt and uncle, sat and complained about the technical incorrect use of words like decimate yesterday, but we should probably just move straight on from that. What was interesting this morning, though, was the big headline is there, but very soon, of course, if you're watching and listening, or if you're one of their rival parties, you say, well, by how much and by how? And when we spoke to Yvette Cooper this morning, she just wouldn't go anywhere near putting a number on it. This is what she had to say.
So we're not setting a target, and the reason for that is because, partly because, to be honest, every time the Conservatives have done this, frankly, then they have just ended up being totally all over the place, ripping it up, and it's discredited the whole system.
But I'm asking what you would like.
No, I understand, just to finish the point. But also because from one year to another, there are variations. So, for example, the pandemic means the net migration figures, of course, fell, but the Homes for Ukraine visa rightly meant that the figures increased because of the war in Ukraine.
But people would like more clarity than just saying, oh, we won't set a number. Maybe you might want to set a goal of a proportion to bring it down. Last year, the most recent figures say net migration was 685,000 people. So when you say you want to bring it down, what do you mean? Do you mean by 1, by 1,000, by 100,000, by 200,000?
No, we clearly want to see significant changes in place because we have seen the numbers treble.
We had a WhatsApp from Louisa. Hello, Louisa. Always good to hear from newscasters. And she said, I'm not entirely convinced by Labour ideas, but I was very impressed with Yvette Cooper not giving a number. The Conservatives have hamstrung themselves for decades by having targets and numbers. It's nice to hear an approach moving away from the figures and focusing on the work and skills gap and migration. Sorry, Laura, I know you were pushing for a number. Well, this is interesting, isn't it? Because Labour's plans are to try to get to a position where we don't need as much migration. But, Henry, how do they actually plan to do that?
Yvette Cooper is right that the Conservatives have tangled themselves in knots for 14 years over the tens of thousands, reducing net migration to the tens of thousands stat that David Cameron initially set, and Theresa May obviously was the Home Secretary for a lot of time, attempting to deliver that. And so clearly they are deciding strategically, tactically, not to have a number that can be held over them. However, I think people, particularly in the Conservative Party, who want immigration to come down, would say the problem for the successive Conservative governments was not the act of having a target, it was the fact that they didn't hit their target. Now, Labour are clearly going to have a looser target. I mean, net migration last year was 685,000. I think a lot of demographers say it's already trending down anyway. So in that respect, Labour seem to have set themselves a target that they would hit. But they say the way they want to hit it is by training more Brits to fill skills gaps. And that actually intersects with some of the later conversations you were having in your programme with Victoria Atkins about health and social care and staffing there. And I was very struck that Shami Chakrabarti, Baroness Chakrabarti, on your panel, former member of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, I think basically on the left of the Labour Party, was quite supportive of that approach. She said, yes, if this is, if this reduction in immigration is fueled by upskilling, to use that awful word, I don't think she used it, by the way, Brits, then that's a good thing.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's very different for us older people. It's very, very different to the kind of language that Labour used a while ago. If you go back to the 2010 election, Labour was sort of a bit panicked into having to suddenly say more about immigration, because for ages it was like, oh, well, we don't talk about that because they'd done freedom of movement under the EU. And then suddenly Gordon Brown comes out with this notion of British jobs for British workers. And a lot of people on the left were like, well, hang on a minute, you shouldn't be using language like that. There was a kind of classic Keir Starmer line on this. It's, I will control our borders, but I will make sure British businesses helped to hire Brits first. And I just thought that phrase is a classic Keir Starmer. I am trying here to look to the left and the right and tell voters that I am on their side, not the left of my party. But he didn't say British jobs for British workers. He did, although he did say crack down on bad bosses, but he's trying, you can see in that phrase, to keep both sides of the argument going.
And it's something that so many Labour leaders wrestle with, not just Gordon Brown. Remember the Ed Stone, which we talked about a bit?
Yeah.
One of the things on the tombstone that Ed Miliband would have put in the garden of Downing Street if he won the election was controls on immigration. They even put it on a mug, famously. And a lot of people then said, well, it's no good Ed Miliband saying controls on immigration because people don't believe that he actually wants to control it in the way that sort of the voters Labour at that point were losing wanted to. One other thing I think is really interesting about this. Where did Keir Starmer say, read my lips?
In The Sun on Sunday.
The Sun on Sunday. And I know that newspapers are not as powerful or influential or widely read as they used to be. In fact, I think their power and influence over elections has always been overstated anyway. But
often by themselves.
Almost solely by themselves. By themselves and their most ardent critics. And
they do matter, though.
Well, I don't know if they do, but for those who think they do,
yeah.
If you're watching what's happening with The Sun, which of course endorsed Blair in his 3 general election victories, having switched then from the Conservatives, they like to back a winner, and they are giving Keir Starmer, I think, a fair wind. And I just think, watch out for that over the next few weeks.
Well, even if you, as a newscaster, don't think that the papers and what they do matters to you, there are still very big clues in where the parties choose to take their electoral wares. And Labour giving interviews and stories to The Sun and to The Telegraph, as they have done repeatedly in the last couple of years, is something very interesting. One of you, a newscaster on the other side of this argument, Nick, has emailed saying, actually, as voters, we do need something tangible to judge a party in terms of where we cast our vote. So some of you listening did want it to be more of a clear target, but Louisa was actually saying, I like this different approach where they're talking about joining up the whole thing and problems in the British workforce. What was interesting also to me, Henry, was that Yvette Cooper didn't rule out sending asylum seekers or people who've come here without permission to other countries. Now, Labour, we know, have been very clear now that they don't like the Rwanda scheme. But she did leave the door open to potentially in the future sending some asylum seekers to other countries for processing. And I thought that was very interesting that she was happy to put that on the record.
And actually, when you were asking Yvette Cooper about that, about the sort of other side of the migration piece, illegal migration and asylum, because of course what we've been talking about before is legal migration, it made me realise it's barely featured in the general election campaign.
So far,
And when I was trying to work out on the morning of a couple of Thursdays ago or Wednesdays ago, whatever it was, whether Rishi Sunak really was about to call a general election, one of the rationales that senior Conservatives came out with was, oh, well, if you have a general election before the Rwanda flight takes off, as they hope it would, although now they're saying it wouldn't, before July the 4th, then that becomes a huge feature of the general election campaign. It's not just about the economy, it's who do you trust more to stop the boats, to use the phrase. But I think it's barely featured at all, partly because the Conservatives haven't talked about it, but also, and I just wonder whether that's going to change, or whether, I don't know, whether both political parties have decided it doesn't necessarily move the target voters they're fighting over that much. I just suddenly realised when you were having that exchange with Yvette Cooper, this has barely featured, and I think that's really interesting in the first couple of weeks.
It is really interesting, and I wonder too is that newscasters might have noticed, if they've been reading things really carefully, there have been some challenges accepted by the courts to the legality around the Rwanda scheme in the last few weeks. So there's been some reporting of that this morning. There are various different cases that are going to be heard. So Labour doesn't really like to say, oh, we're not doing this big, bold, radical idea. They don't like to shout about that particularly. And the Tories at the moment don't want to shout about it, perhaps because of that. But we will see what happens in the campaign. On this issue, though, we should say that a spokesperson for the Tory party said about Keir Starmer's plan, this is the man who called all immigration laws racist and voted against tougher border controls 139 times. They're referring to the Rwanda legislation there. And also this is an issue in Scotland where there are very different demographics in terms of the population and needing people for the economy. Alison Thewlis from the SNP said the problem is Westminster, not migrants. And the Lib Dems, as Daisy Cooper was on our programme this morning, have said the Tories have failed on immigration. Now, Diane Abbott. There's still the kind of hangover of what's been a very nasty row. We talked about it a lot yesterday, but there were some interesting comments about it this morning, Henry, weren't there?
Well, I thought the most interesting comments were from Shami Chakrabarti.
He's a close friend.
Of Diane Abbott. Yeah. And she seemed to imply that there is a genuine chance Diane Abbott now decides not to stand. Now, I've spent a lot of the past week trying to work out what on earth is going on here. And,
good luck with that.
Yeah, and clearly what blew the entire delicate dance up was the briefing to the Times from whoever it was in the Labour Party, and Shami Chakrabarti said she'd had assurances that that wasn't a licensed briefing.
But we should play Newscast as the clip of how she described what had happened, because she was furious and she gave us a very colourful description of what the blue suits had been up to. Do you think that she will stand again?
I hope that she will now, after this sometimes sordid week of unauthorised, anonymous briefings by overgrown schoolboys in suits with their feet on the table and maybe watching too much West Wing but not taking on its more progressive values. I hope, and by the way, I hope they remember it's supposed to be country first, not faction first. I hope she will take some time to consider, you know, what she wants to do, and that's literally what I've suggested to her as her friend, and I hope that's what she's going to do.
But people who at least weren't behind those briefings, but were saying they didn't think Diane Abbott was going to be a Labour candidate at the general election, were saying, look, she's told us that, you know, there was no shortage of people at the top of the Labour Party who believed that Diane Abbott had given assurances, not actually under duress, but because she's, you know, been an MP for 40 years and all of that. In fact, she'd be the longest serving Labour MP if she stands and wins at the general election. They believed they'd got assurances from her that she didn't want to stand anyway. Now, clearly, if that is the case, you can see why being told that she was being barred would inflame the situation and lead to, as it did, her on the steps of Hackney Town Hall saying, I will stand. But now that she's been told she can stand in a slightly counterintuitive way, it does appear that she's giving consideration to not doing so.
Yvette Cooper also this morning sort of pretty much denied that Diane Abbott had been offered a peerage to stand down, but she gave that sort of politician's answer of, I don't know anything about that. So that was it was a denial that she wasn't aware of it, but it wasn't a complete ruling out that such a conversation might have happened. Imagine that MPs might be offered inducements to do things by party leaders. Clarifying, I'm not saying that's what happened in this case, but that kind of thing does definitely go on.
I had a really interesting conversation yesterday, Laura. I tried to take the day off, but...
What, an election campain?
Well, it was a Saturday. Anyway, there I was, sitting, watching Saturday Kitchen, and my phone rang. It was a Tory MP who I've known for many years. And as you know, when you have contacts, MPs, whatever, who you speak to over several years, you grow to learn their general disposition, if they're pessimistic, if they're optimistic, where they're coming from, who they like, who they don't like. This is a Conservative MP who I'd spoken to maybe 8 days before, who was adamant that Rishi Sunak would narrow the polls, that in their constituency people really weren't that persuaded by Keir Starmer, and so on and so on. And they called me up, and I paraphrased because I don't have my notes in front of me, and they said, Henry, we are doomed. And they said that they had had a realisation on the doorstep that day, on Saturday, that, well, they said, you know, for 2 years, every Conservative MP has sat there thinking, well, the polls are going to narrow at some point, and then we're in business. And they said, I just had this realisation. The polls aren't going to narrow. And they said, if after this week's debate on Tuesday between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, the polls don't begin to narrow, they said, mark my words, Conservative MPs are going to panic.
That's fascinating, because that also somebody in Tory HQ said that to me a couple of days ago. They said if nothing else shifts by the end of next week, or their implication was if nothing else shifts quite soon, essentially, and I paraphrase, people are going to start losing their marbles. Because what we've seen in the last week is the Tories have chucked out more new policies than anybody else. And they've chucked out policies that should appeal to their base voters. National Service definitely got people talking. Some of the guarantees on pensions, for example, targeted absolutely exocet missile, like at their core vote. And yet the polls haven't budged.
No, and in fact,
all.
if they have budged in any direction over the sort of overall average, they have sort of nudged very gently in the direction of the Labour Party.
However, what someone else close to the campaign has said to me, what they did feel kind of relatively content about, I mean, they're not like punching in the air and say, oh, we're saved, it's all fine. But they did feel actually that they had been able to set some of the terms of the conversation, that they had managed to grab voters' attention, which they just felt for months, like people, there was just like, they're not even listening. You know, we're kind of written off. People aren't even listening. Actually, there's kind of a chink that at least people might go, oh, well, they've given us something to talk about. Maybe we'll take a little bit of a look. So it's interesting that MPs are saying that on the doors, and that conversation is, you know, I think mirrored by many others, because also MPs have been in Westminster a lot of the time and they've been in their constituencies, but suddenly they're going around knocking on lots and lots of doors, talking to hundreds and hundreds of voters. And I think there is that sense of coming back from the doorstep that actually it is feral for them out there. But it's still early. Voters are definitely still volatile, still huge numbers of don't knows in the polling that comes across. And, you know, there's only one real poll that counts. It's the real poll when people put a cross in the box. And the Tories, again, are coming up with new policy today. Victoria Atkins, the Health Secretary, was on the show today promising more community health care, more pharmacies giving more treatments, whether that's the two examples they picked were chest infections and acne. And I thought, I'm not sure that talking to voters about acne is something that's really going to get people dancing
Well,
in the
I guess
streets.
then it's the same voters who they're saying that you can join up the army, but we'll treat your acne while you're there.
There have been lots and lots of very funny memes actually in the first week on both sides. Actually, the Tories had one yesterday with it was a mock-up of Angela Rayner texting Diane Abbott saying, "Don't worry, Diane, I'll sort it. Love Angie," or something like that. And the Tories faced on the other side a lot of Labour social media activity around young people being told they'd have to do compulsory national service of one kind or another, whether it's voluntary. But this morning, Victoria Atkins said there'd be 100 new GP surgeries. She said they would expand the scheme, which is called Pharmacy First, where you can get more different kinds of treatment. I think the problem for the Tories on this policy is it's a representation of the problem they're going to have across the board, is as soon as you start digging into the numbers, which of course we did yesterday when we knew this announcement was coming, you look at what's happened in years before, and 450 GP surgeries had shut over a particular period of time. More than 1,000 pharmacies have shut over a particular period of time, and their funding had been cut over a particular period of time. So Victoria Atkins absolutely didn't want to acknowledge this, but I think a lot of voters will look at their plans as they come out and essentially think they're unpicking their previous mistakes.
With pharmacies, we know that 4 out of 5 people are within a 20-minute walk of their nearest pharmacy. And importantly, there is a much higher concentration of pharmacies in deprived areas, which means that we will be able to, for these basic conditions, we will be able to secure faster access to healthcare.
But the point here is that you are replacing services that had disappeared.
Forgive me. If I may, on the GP point, we in fact have 2,711 more GPs working in the NHS worse than even in 2019.
And the population is bigger than it was.
And we've seen record numbers working across primary care. We have some 39,000 staff. And if you go to some of the GP practices that I see on my travels as health secretary, you'll see that the practices have not just GPs, but they're supported by physios, they're supported by nurses, they're supported by paramedics. So there are different ways in which people can access primary care.
This is the Conservative challenge, isn't it, as you said, Laura, across the board. They are running on a record, and they are running on a 14-year record, and the other parties simply don't have that. And that applied also to another area where you questioned Victoria Atkins, which was social care.
Yeah.
You said, come on, where's your plan for social care? Is there going to be one in the manifesto? We've known this has been a huge issue for 14 years.
Yeah.
And Victoria Atkins said, well, I think, to be fair, it goes back further than that. And that's true.
It's true.
I mean, it's true that a big part of the 2010 general election was Andy Burnham, the then Health Secretary's plan, which the Conservatives labelled as a death tax. So, yeah, this all goes back a long way. But that's a harder argument to make when you've had 14 years to be the ones who fix it.
And also when you repeatedly, your own leaders have said they'd fix it and then they haven't. So, you know, David Cameron and George Osborne did it, and then George Osborne dropped it because it was going to cost £6 billion. Imagine that now, 14 years on, if a leader said was told by the Treasury it would cost £6 billion to fix this problem, I think they'd probably bite their hand off and say, fine, let's do it. But back then, I think it was in 2011, I'm getting old, but George Osborne, the Treasury basically turned it down. But Boris Johnson stood outside Downing Street and said, to fix the NHS, you have to fix social care, and I'm going to do it. Theresa May had her calamity in 2017, but she said she was going to do it.
I mean, that was the real turning point, actually, I think, in the history of social care in this country, because they made a decision. They said, we are going to win this election big. Let's get the public, via our manifesto, to endorse something that in different times might be unpalatable. And it collapsed their general election campaign. And so I'm sure there are people sitting in both party HQs thinking, well, in an ideal world, we'd put some detailed, complex, perhaps tricky plans on social care in there. But why would any party strategist worth their salt do that after what happened to Theresa May in 2017?
I think for people who work in the sector, though, and, you know, anybody who works in a hospital or anybody who works in the health service as a GP or, you know, even social workers or anybody would tell you that actually this is something that is creaking, that is having huge problems. It has terrible impacts on families' lives. And that actually goes right round the UK because, of course, health is devolved. There are really profound problems in this country with how we care for our vulnerable and elderly. It's not simple for any politician, but it does look like we're going into a general election where nobody's got the guts to put forward anything very significant. And in the last 6 months, we've repeatedly asked Wes Streeting. You know, it's become almost a bit of a gag with him, the Shadow Health Secretary. Every time he comes on the show, we're like, well, where's your social care plan? And he's like, oh, it's coming, it's coming. And come it has not. And I don't think it's going to be in the Labour manifesto in any big way. Yes, all the parties have ideas to do things around social care, but a kind of big bang, bold reform doesn't seem to be anywhere in sight. Wes Streeting today accused the Tories of breaking the manifesto promise on GPs. But the Lib Dems, Daisy Cooper, was on the programme this morning, and she told us about the Lib Dems' plans for $1 billion a year for public health. But where do you get the cash from?
Well, this particular pledge would be funded by cracking down on tax avoidance. We know that
every political party always says that, and the returns are not always what they hope for.
Well, we'll have a fully costed manifesto, but the Conservatives themselves have said they think they could raise $6 billion from cracking down on tax avoidance. So the question does arise why they haven't done it already.
I'm going to get a big red button in my fantasy head. Every time somebody says fully costed, every time somebody says tax avoidance, we're going to pay for it with tax avoidance. Everybody says that now. The Tories, I think, last weekend came up with somehow an extra $6 billion in tax avoidance that they were going to find from down the back of the sofa via the hands of the HMRC. But that was Lib Dem Daisy Cooper, who was on our show this morning. There's been lots of news. One last thing I do want to mention, because we've done a lot about it on this programme and also on Sunday mornings. You might remember really heartbreaking interviews that we've done with the families of people who have lost their children in circumstances related to things that have happened on social media. And one of the things that bereaved families had campaigned on was for tech companies to have to hand over their kids' content. So to have to share them their messages and photos after they had passed away. They'd fought for that. The government had agreed to it. But that promise was dropped in the panic of trying to get legislation through when the election was called, the so-called wash-up, and we talked about it on Newscast. So this morning, we asked if whichever party wins, would they commit to bringing that into fixing that? Because it had already been agreed. And of course, these families who'd campaigned for a long time were devastated when this had ended up not going through Parliament. Labour's Peter Kyle and Labour's Yvette Cooper this morning said, yes, they would do it right away. Victoria Atkins said, if it was up to me, absolutely yes, but you'll have to wait and see for the manifesto. So I just wanted to put that out there. It's an issue we've talked about a lot. We've talked about it on Newscast, and it is one of these things where it's not the kind of meat and drink of a general election, but that whole issue of what happens to kids when they're online is massive. We know it's massive. Our inbox is always full of these things. So I just wanted to share that with people.
And I've spoken to these campaigners as well, not as extensively as you.
Yes, of course.
And, you know, they are the most powerful, eloquent, of course, because of the awful things that have happened to them and their children. But they are the doubtiest campaigners, and any government, whatever hue, that tries to delay or obfuscate, they ain't going to win. And the Conservative government has learnt that lesson, and any government of any stripe would learn that pretty fast. And
Ian Russell, I understand, is actually publishing a manifesto tomorrow. Ian Russell, the father of Molly, who took her own life after her experiences on social media. So maybe that will be something that the guys talk about. Maybe you'll talk about on tomorrow's Newscast. Lovely to be with everybody listening and watching on this Sunday's Newscast. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.